The veil had taken her mother 3 years to embroider. Every flower, every thread stitched by hands that trembled at the end but never stopped. Her mother had believed, with the particular stubbornness of dying women, that a daughter deserved something beautiful to walk toward. Elizabeth Ashford stood in the doorway of her own marriage chamber and watched that veil, her mother's last gift to her, draped like a common curtain over another woman's vanity mirror. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply stood there long enough to be certain of what she was looking at. Then she turned around, walked back down the hall and began, very quietly, to think. The carriage reached Ravenswood Manor just as the afternoon light was turning the color of old amber, the kind of light that makes everything look warmer than it is. Elizabeth watched the house appear through the window and told herself it was simply a building. Stone and glass and mortar. It could not mean anything unless she allowed it to. She had been telling herself useful things like that for the better part of 3 weeks, since the morning her father had sat across from her at the breakfast table, cleared his throat twice, and informed her that her future had been arranged. The Duke of Ravenswood required a wife. The Ashford family required salvation. The mathematics were straightforward enough. Elizabeth was 24, unmarried, and not so vain as to pretend she did not understand her position. What she had not anticipated was that no one would come to the door. The carriage rolled to a stop on the gravel drive. She waited. A full minute passed, she counted it, before a footman appeared, not hurrying, moving with the particular ease of a man who has been told there is no need to rush. He opened the carriage door, offered his hand, and said nothing. Not welcome, not congratulations, not even her name. Elizabeth stepped down and looked up at the house. Every window reflected sky. Nothing moved behind any of them. "His Grace sends his apologies," the footman said, in a tone that suggested no such apologies had actually been sent. "He is occupied with estate business this afternoon. Mrs. Plum will show you to your rooms." The housekeeper materialized at the top of the entrance steps, a small, solid woman somewhere north of 60, with a ring of keys at her hip and an expression so carefully neutral it told Elizabeth everything. This woman had opinions. She was simply not yet sure whether Elizabeth was worth sharing them with. "Your Grace," Mrs. Plum dipped into a brief curtsy, "if you'll follow me." She was given a room at the far end of the east wing. It was not unpleasant, the furniture was good, the fireplace was lit, and someone had put fresh flowers on the writing table, but it was not the Duchess's chamber. Elizabeth had read enough about Ravenswood to know where that was, and the east wing was not it. She did not ask. She unpacked her own things while the maid hovered uselessly near the door, and she moved slowly and methodically, the way she had learned to do everything in the past 3 weeks. Methodically, without feeling too much at once. It was when she went looking for the washroom that she saw it. The door to the master chamber was not quite closed. Just a few inches open, enough for light to spill through, and enough for Elizabeth, passing in the corridor, to stop walking. The room beyond was not empty. A woman sat at the vanity mirror, dark-haired, beautiful in the particular way of women who are very aware of it, pinning something into her elaborate coiffure. Not a ribbon, not a scrap of lace. Her mother's veil, the embroidered one, the one that had been packed with such care into Elizabeth's trousseau trunk, pinned at the woman's temple like a fashion ornament, the ivory silk trailing over one bare shoulder, the tiny hand-stitched roses catching the light. Elizabeth stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time. The woman at the mirror met her eyes in the reflection and did not look away, did not apologize, did not even have the grace to look uncertain. She simply watched Elizabeth with the steady, unapologetic gaze of someone who has been told, very clearly, that she has nothing to fear. Elizabeth said nothing. She stood there until she was sure, completely sure, of every detail of what she was looking at. The veil, the woman, the open door, the room that should have been hers. Then she turned, walked back to the east wing, and sat down in the chair nearest the window. Outside, the amber light was fading. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 5. Elizabeth folded her hands in her lap and thought, very carefully, about what she was going to do next. Dinner was at 8. She was informed of this by a note slipped under her door, not a personal invitation, not a handwritten line from her husband. A note, the kind one sent to a guest whose name one could not quite recall. She wore her gray silk. It was not her best dress, and she knew it, and she chose it deliberately, the way one chooses a particular expression before walking into a room. She wanted to look like someone who had not tried. The Duke was already seated when she arrived. He rose briefly, mechanically, and gestured to the chair across from him at the far end of a table that could have seated 20. The distance between them was not accidental. Edmund Ravenswood was younger than she had expected. She had constructed a picture in her mind, older, heavy, the kind of man who acquires a wife the same way he acquires furniture, and he did not match it. He was perhaps 30, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had probably been charming before it learned to be cold. He looked at her the way one looks at an addition to the household accounts. Present, noted, not particularly interesting. "You arrived without difficulty," he said. It was the first of 4 things he said to her that evening. "Yes," Elizabeth said, "thank you." The soup came. He did not speak. She ate and watched him without appearing to, cataloguing. The way he held his glass. The way his eyes moved toward the door at 10-minute intervals, as if expecting someone. The way his expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, when it became clear that someone was not coming. The second thing he said to her was, "You have been assigned the East Rooms. I trust they're adequate." "Quite," Elizabeth said. The third was a correction. She had referred to a neighboring estate by the wrong name, an easy mistake. She had only read it, never heard it spoken, and he corrected her without looking up from his plate. Flatly, the way one corrects a child or a servant. The fourth thing he said was, "I keep early hours, you need not wait up." She looked at him across the long table and recognized with a clarity that surprised her that he was not a cruel man in the way she had feared. He was something more difficult than that. He was a man who had decided before she ever arrived that she did not matter, not that she was hateful, not that she was threatening, simply that she was an arrangement, and arrangements required no particular attention. Elizabeth looked down at her plate. In the center of her chest, something that had been soft grew very, very quiet, and then it hardened. Gently, almost imperceptibly, the way water becomes ice, without drama, without noise. Just a slow, certain change of state. "Good night, Your Grace," she said when the meal was done. He nodded once, already reaching for his brandy. She walked back to the east wing alone, carrying a candle, listening to her own footsteps in the corridor. At the door to her room, she paused for just a moment and looked toward the far end of the hall, where the master chamber door was now firmly shut, and a thin line of lamplight glowed beneath it. She went inside. She set the candle down. She sat at the writing table and opened the small leather journal she had carried with her since her mother died. She wrote 3 words. Then she closed it and went to bed and lay in the dark with her eyes open, thinking not about the veil, not about the dinner, not about the woman at the mirror, but about a key. A small brass key she had noticed when Mrs. Plum walked her through the house, hanging on its own separate hook in the housekeeper's pantry, away from all the others, as if it opened something that required a different kind of consideration. She would ask about that key tomorrow. She had a feeling it was going to be important. She asked about the key at breakfast. Not directly. Elizabeth had learned early that direct questions produced careful answers, and careful answers told you very little. Instead, she mentioned, conversationally, that she had noticed the late Duchess had kept a private library, and that she would very much enjoy reading during her afternoons, if the room was available. Mrs. Plum poured her tea and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I'll see what can be arranged, Your Grace." By noon, the key was on Elizabeth's writing table. No note, no explanation, just the key, small and brass, placed exactly in the center of the table as if it had always belonged there. Elizabeth picked it up and held it for a moment. Then she put it in her pocket and went to learn the house. What she learned was this: she had no authority over anything. It took her 4 days to understand the full shape of it. The menus were set by someone else. She discovered this when she mentioned to the kitchen that she did not care for partridge and found partridge on the table the following evening regardless. The household correspondence went through the Duke's secretary, a thin, precise man named Mr. Hobbs, who accepted her suggestions with elaborate courtesy and then did exactly as he liked. When she asked about the weekly accounts, she was told, gently but firmly, that His Grace preferred to manage those matters personally. She was Duchess of Ravenswood in the same way a painting on a wall is part of a house: present, decorative, not consulted. The servants were polite. They were also watching. She could feel it, the careful calibration of their attention, the way they waited to see which way the household would finally settle. They had survived the old Duke. They were surviving this one. They would survive whoever came next. It was only a question of where one's loyalties were safest. Only Mrs. Plum moved differently. She did not watch Elizabeth the way the others did. She watched her the way one watches something one has been hoping for and is not yet sure one deserves to trust. On the 5th day, when Elizabeth came down to breakfast and found that her usual chair had been moved, not removed, simply shifted 3 feet to the left, just enough to be wrong, and that the chair in its place was set for someone who was not her, she sat down in the wrong chair without comment, ate her breakfast, and asked Mrs. Plum afterward if she knew whether the library was warm enough to sit in through the afternoon. "I'll have it fired, Your Grace," Mrs. Plum said, and then very quietly so that no one else in the corridor could have heard it, "She won't last. They never do." Elizabeth did not ask who she meant. She already knew. The library was at the end of a corridor on the 2nd floor, behind a door that looked like a wall panel if you didn't know what you were looking for. The late Duchess, it seemed, had valued her privacy. Elizabeth could not blame her. Inside, it smelled of old paper and lavender and something faintly mineral, like a room that had been closed for a long time. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 sides. There was a desk near the window, a good chair, and a lamp that still worked. Someone, Mrs. Plum, Elizabeth suspected, had left a vase of fresh flowers on the corner of the desk. Roses. White ones. Almost aggressively cheerful against all that old wood and shadow. Elizabeth sat down at the desk and looked at the shelves. She had come for books. She had told herself she had come for books. But what she found, on the lowest shelf behind a row of matching volumes that had clearly not been touched in years, was a set of ledgers. They were not hidden exactly. They were simply placed where someone would have to be looking in order to find them. 6 identical volumes, dark green, with years stamped on the spines in faded gold. The earliest was dated 30 years ago. The most recent ended 2 years before the old Duke's death. Elizabeth pulled the most recent one onto the desk and opened it. She was not an accountant. Her father had never believed in educating women in finance, which she had always considered a significant failure of imagination on his part. But she was careful, and she was patient, and she had spent enough of her girlhood watching her family's circumstances decline to understand, in general terms, what a healthy set of accounts looked like versus what these looked like. These did not look healthy. She worked through the afternoon. By the time the light began to fail, she had made it through 4 of the 6 volumes, and what she had found was this: Ravenswood was not merely in debt. It was in catastrophic, carefully concealed, architecturally structured debt. The kind of debt that did not happen by accident, the kind that took planning. But it was not the debt that stopped her, it was the payments. Running through every volume, regular as a heartbeat, quarterly, without fail, in varying amounts that always totaled the same annual sum, payments made out to the same name. Not a creditor, not a bank, a name. A person's name, or what appeared to be one, written each time in the same careful hand and always accompanied by the same notation in the margin. 2 letters, nothing else. A.A. Elizabeth sat very still and looked at those 2 letters for a long time. She did not know what they meant yet. She was not sure she was ready to. but she turned to the inside cover of the oldest volume, where a previous hand had written the date of its beginning, and beneath the date, in faded ink, 3 words that she read twice before she let herself believe them. For the record. Not a title, not a label, a statement. Someone had wanted these to exist, had wanted them found. She closed the ledger carefully and sat in the darkening room and thought about that. About what it meant that this library had been locked. About what it meant that the key had been kept separate from all the others. About what it meant that a dying woman had taken the time to organize 6 volumes of household accounts and put them somewhere a careful person might eventually look. The late Duchess had known something. She had left a door open, not obviously, not carelessly, but deliberately, for whoever came next. Elizabeth was whoever came next. She replaced the ledgers exactly as she had found them, behind the unread volumes on the lowest shelf. Then she locked the library, put the key back in her pocket, and went down to dress for dinner. The Duke was already at the table when she arrived. He looked up when she entered briefly, automatically, and returned to his correspondence. He was reading something that required concentration, or that he preferred she believe required concentration. His brandy glass was already half empty. Elizabeth sat down across the long table and unfolded her napkin, and looked at her husband's bent head and thought about 2 letters. She thought about payments that ran for 30 years without stopping. She thought about a woman she had never met who had locked a room and kept a key, and trusted that someone, eventually, would be paying attention. "You seemed thoughtful this evening," the Duke said without looking up. It was not a question. It was not quite a compliment. It was the kind of observation that functions as a warning. "I have noticed something, and I am noting that I have noticed." "I've been reading," Elizabeth said. He looked up then, just briefly. His eyes moved over her face with the same efficiency he applied to everything: assessing, cataloging, filing. Then he returned to his correspondence. "The library," he said. "Mrs. Plum told me." "I hope that's not an inconvenience," Elizabeth said pleasantly. "Not at all." He turned a page. "My mother's books. No one's touched them in years. You're welcome to them." He said it with the easy generosity of a man who is certain there is nothing in that room worth worrying about. Elizabeth looked at her soup and kept her expression entirely still. "Thank you," she said. "I find I have a great deal of time to read." The Duke did not respond. She had not expected him to. She ate her dinner and said nothing else, and let him believe, as he clearly wished to believe, that she was exactly what she appeared to be: a quiet woman in a gray dress, at the wrong end of a very long table, causing no trouble. She was causing no trouble. Not yet. But she was thinking about a cousin, her father's sister's son, returned from 4 years abroad, who had written to her 3 times since the engagement was announced, and whom she had not yet answered. A man who had known her family for 30 years. A man who, now that she thought about it, might know rather a lot about things that had happened in the years before she was old enough to notice them. She would write to Lord Harwick tonight. It seemed like an excellent time to reconnect with family. Harwick's reply came in 4 days, which told her he had been waiting for her to write. It was a short letter, 1 page, careful handwriting, the kind of letter that has been composed and reconsidered before being sent. He was well. He was glad to hear from her. He had business in the county at the end of the month and would be honored, if it suited, to pay his respects at Ravenswood. He did not mention her father. He did not mention the marriage. He said only, in the final line, in a tone so mild it could easily be missed, "There are things I have wanted to say to you for some time, Elizabeth. I am glad the occasion has finally presented itself." She showed the letter to no one. She replied the same afternoon, and she told the Duke at dinner, casually, between the fish course and the meat, that her cousin Lord Harwick would be passing through, and she had taken the liberty of extending an invitation for the weekend party. There was a pause, brief, controlled, but there. "Harwick," the Duke said, not a question, a repetition, the kind that buys time. "We grew up together," Elizabeth said. "I haven't seen him in 6 years. I hope that's not an inconvenience." Another pause, then, "Of course not." He reached for his wine. "The house will be full that weekend in any case. One more is no difficulty." He said it smoothly, but she noticed that he did not look at her when he said it, and that his hand, reaching for the wine glass, moved with slightly more deliberation than usual, as if he needed to remind himself to be steady. Elizabeth cut her meat and said nothing. She filed that away with everything else. The weekend party was the kind of social event that Ravenswood apparently produced with some regularity: 20 guests, 3 days, dinners that required a seating chart and a small degree of strategy. Elizabeth had been given no role in the planning. The invitations had gone out before she arrived. The menus were set. The rooms assigned. She was informed of the guest list by Mr. Hobbs as one is informed of the weather, as a fact, not a consultation. She spent the days before it in the library. She had been back every afternoon since finding the ledgers. She was methodical about it, working through the volumes in order, noting the payments, tracing the amounts, building in her mind a picture that was still incomplete but was beginning to have a shape. The payments to AA had started 31 years ago, 2 years before Elizabeth was born. They had never missed a quarter. They had increased gradually over time, as if tracking something: inflation, perhaps, or escalating silence. She did not yet know what AA stood for, but she was becoming increasingly certain that whatever it was, it had something to do with her family, the amounts, the timing, the way the notation was always written in the same careful hand that appeared nowhere else in the ledgers, not the estate steward's hand, not the old Duke's. Someone else's entirely. Someone who had wanted it recorded but not explained. She was still thinking about it when the carriages began to arrive on Friday afternoon. Harwick came last, as if he had timed it. The other guests were already assembled in the drawing room when she heard the final carriage on the gravel, and she was at the window when he stepped out, taller than she remembered, broader across the shoulders, with the particular ease of a man who has spent 4 years somewhere that required him to rely on himself entirely. He looked up at the house first. Then, as if he knew she would be watching, he looked directly at her window. Elizabeth stepped back from the glass, then felt immediately foolish for it and stepped forward again, but he had already looked away. She met him in the entrance hall 5 minutes later, with 12 other guests milling around them and the Duke standing at the far end of the room receiving a baronet and his wife. Harwick came to her directly, not waiting to be announced, not pausing to read the room, and took both her hands in his and looked at her with an expression she could not quite name. Not pity. Something more complicated than pity. "Elizabeth," he said her name the way people say names they have been careful with. "You look well." "You look surprised that I do," she said. He laughed genuinely, a real laugh that several people turned to look at because it was the loudest sound that had been made in that entrance hall in some time. "I've missed you," he said simply. 6 years is too long." "It is," she agreed. From the far end of the room, she felt the Duke's attention shift. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Harwick and smiled, and it was the first entirely unguarded smile she had produced since arriving at Ravenswood, and she knew it, and she did not try to correct it. Dinner that evening seated 30. Elizabeth was at the head of the table. Her position as hostess could not be entirely erased, even by an arrangement as thorough as Edmund's. And Harwick was placed, by some coincidence that she suspected was not a coincidence, directly to her left. The Duke was at the other end. He had Cecily somewhere nearby, not at the table, not publicly. She was not a fool, but present in the house in a way that everyone was carefully pretending not to notice. There was a particular quality to the servants' movements that evening. Too precise. Too studied. The performance of a household that has been instructed to maintain appearances and is doing so with considerable effort. Harwick ate and talked and was charming in the effortless way of men who have learned to put people at ease as a practical skill rather than an affectation. He drew out the shy wife on his right. He complimented the wine with enough specificity to be genuine. He told a story about a market in Lisbon that made the table laugh. And between all of it, quietly, without any apparent shift in tone, He spoke to Elizabeth. "How are you finding Ravenswood?" he asked between the second and third course. "Large," she said, "quiet, full of history." "I imagine it is." He reached for his wine. "Have you had much chance to explore?" "I've been spending time in the library," she said, watching him carefully. "The late Duchess kept an interesting collection." Something moved across his face. Very quickly, very controlled, but she had been watching for it. "Did she?" he said, not a question. Elizabeth cut her meat. Very organized, very thorough, the kind of woman who believed in keeping records. Harwick was quiet for a moment. Around them the table talked and laughed and the candles burned steadily. At the far end, she was aware of the Duke's eyes moving to them at intervals. She could feel it, the specific quality of that attention, but she did not look up. "Elizabeth," Harwick said quietly, "how much do you know?" "Not enough," she said. "Yet." He nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had already suspected. "After dinner," he said. "The garden, if it's fine. I think it's time we talked." It was fine. The evening was cool and clear, the kind of autumn night that smells of wood smoke and turned leaves, and the garden behind the house was lit only by what came through the windows. They walked along the far path, away from the light and the sound of the other guests, and Harwick talked. He talked for a long time. Elizabeth listened without interrupting, which was something she had always been good at, and which had always made people underestimate how much she was absorbing. He told her what he knew. Not everything. He was honest about the gaps, about the things he had suspected for years without being able to prove. But enough. Enough for the shape of it to become clear. Enough for Elizabeth to feel, with a cold and oddly steady sensation, the pieces she had found in the ledgers clicking into place around what he was saying like a frame around a picture. Her family's ruin had not been bad luck. It had not been her father's carelessness, though there had been plenty of that too. It had been engineered, deliberately, carefully, over a period of years, by a man who had wanted something that belonged to the Ashfords and had found it simpler to destroy them than to negotiate with them. The old Duke of Ravenswood, Edmund's father. "There was a contract," Harwick said. "Land. The northern parcels your grandfather held, the ones that were absorbed into the Ravenswood estate after your father's debts were called in. The debt itself was manufactured, a forged signature on a financial instrument. Your father never borrowed that money. He never knew the document existed until the collector arrived." Elizabeth stood very still in the dark garden and looked at the lit windows of the house. "You have proof of this?" she asked. "I have a copy of the original contract," Harwick said, "with the signature, and I have a letter written by the solicitor who drew it up to a colleague. He had a conscience about it, apparently, though not enough of one to say anything while the old Duke was alive." He paused. "I've had these for 2 years, Elizabeth. I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't know if the situation—" He stopped. "I'm sorry it took me this long." "You're here now," Elizabeth said. She said it simply, without accusation, because she meant it simply. He was here now. That was what mattered. She could not afford to spend energy on what had already passed. "There is one more thing," Harwick said. He said it carefully, the way one says things one is not sure will be welcome. "The payments in the ledgers, the quarterly ones." Elizabeth turned to look at him. "AA," she said. He looked at her for a moment with something that was almost relief, that she already knew, that he did not have to lead her to it. "Arthur Ashford," he said. "Your father's eldest brother, the one who died before you were born, except—" He paused. "He didn't die, Elizabeth. He was paid to disappear. He knew about the contract. He was the only witness. The old Duke bought his silence and his absence for 30 years. He paused again. "Those payments stopped 6 months ago." Elizabeth looked back at the house. At the warm windows, the solid stone, the roofline against the stars. "Why 6 months ago?" she asked, though she thought she already knew. "Because that's when Edmund found the letters," Harwick said quietly. "The ones his father left. I believe he's known since then. What he's done with that knowledge, I can't tell you. I don't know if he intends to act or to bury it or whether your marriage is part of it, but I think you need to find out. And I think," he added, "that you are considerably better placed to do so than I am." Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 10. The sound drifted out through the warm windows and across the dark garden, and Elizabeth listened to it and thought about a man who had corrected her pronunciation at dinner and not looked at her when he spoke and drunk his brandy in silence every night for 2 weeks. A man who might know everything, or nothing, or something in between, which was the most dangerous possibility of all. "Thank you, James," she said. She had not used his given name in years. It surprised him she could see it. "Be careful," he said. "I intend to be," she said. "I intend to be a great many things." She went back inside. She straightened her spine and smoothed her skirt and walked through the drawing room where the remaining guests were playing cards, and she nodded pleasantly and said the correct things, and she felt the Duke's eyes follow her across the room. She did not look at him. She had a great deal to think about, and thinking, she had found, was always easier when no one knew you were doing it. The guests left on Sunday. Harwick was the last to go again, as if he had timed it, and he pressed her hand at the door and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been said in the garden. Elizabeth watched his carriage until it disappeared through the gate, and then she went back inside and upstairs to the library and locked the door behind her. She had 3 things now: the ledgers, what Harwick had told her, and a question she had been turning over since Friday night, the one that kept her awake in the cold East Wing room while the house settled around her. The payments had stopped 6 months ago when Edmund found his father's letters, but they had been running for 30 years before that. 30 years of quarterly payments to a man who had witnessed a crime and been bought into silence. Which meant that for the first 26 years of Edmund's life, all of it, every year until he inherited and began to manage the estate himself, those payments had been made without his knowledge. He had inherited not just a dukedom but a concealed crime. A running debt of conscience paid out of his family's accounts to a man he had never met. She pulled the most recent ledger onto the desk and turned to the final entries. The last quarterly payment to AA was dated 8 months ago. Then nothing. The line simply stopped. No notation, no explanation. Just absence where presence had been for 3 decades. And then 4 pages later, in a different section of accounts entirely, estate improvements, it was labeled a single entry. Recent. Dated 5 months ago. A significant sum made out not to a name but to a firm. A London firm of solicitors. The handwriting was not the estate steward's. It was not Mr. Hobbs's careful clerk's hand. It was a hand she had not seen in the ledgers before, firm, slightly compressed, the hand of someone who writes quickly and with purpose. She had seen Edmund sign the household correspondence exactly once, when a document had required his personal signature in her presence. She had not forgotten it. She looked at that entry for a long time. Then she went back through all 6 volumes methodically, page by page, looking for any other entries in that same hand. She found 2, both recent, both in the final volume, both to the same London firm. 3 payments, 5 months, 4 months, 3 months ago, all after the quarterly payments to Arthur Ashford had stopped. All substantial, all made in Edmund's own hand, in the estate accounts, under a category that would draw no particular attention from anyone who was not looking closely. Elizabeth sat back in her chair and pressed her fingers together and thought. There were 2 ways to read it. The first, Edmund had discovered his father's crime, stopped the payments to silence Arthur Ashford, and engaged a London solicitor to make the problem disappear quietly. To bury it. He was continuing the cover-up, more efficiently than his father had managed it, with the particular competence of a man who was very good at managing things. The second, Edmund had discovered the crime, stopped the payments because they were no longer necessary, because he intended to act, and engaged a London solicitor to begin the legal process of correction. Restitution. The return of what had been stolen. The ledgers could not tell her which. The handwriting could not tell her which. Only Edmund could tell her which, and Edmund was not a man who told her anything. She needed to know the name of the solicitor's firm. It took her 4 days. She could not ask directly, not without revealing that she had been in the ledgers, and she was not ready for that yet. She could not ask Mrs. Plum, who she trusted more than anyone in the house but who was still a servant with loyalties she could not fully map. She could not write to Harwick, because his letters came through the house post, and she had no certainty they were not opened. What she could do was watch Mr. Hobbs. The secretary received and sent correspondence every morning between 9 and 11, in his small office off the main corridor. Elizabeth began walking past that office at regular intervals, not suspiciously, not with any apparent purpose, simply as part of the movement of a woman who was learning a large house. On the third day, she saw what she needed: a packet of documents on Mr. Hobbs's desk, sealed and addressed, the name of the recipient firm visible on the outer wrapper. She did not stop walking. She did not slow her pace. She read it in the half-second that she passed the open door and kept the name in her mind with the careful deliberateness of someone committing something to memory that they cannot afford to write down. That afternoon, she went to the library and wrote it in the back of the small leather journal, under the 3 words she had written on her first night. She looked at those 3 words now, the ones she had written in the dark on the night she arrived, when she had sat at this desk with a candle and something cold and quiet hardening in her chest. I am here. She had written them as a statement of fact, a reminder for whatever difficult mornings were coming that she existed, that she was present, that she had not disappeared simply because someone had treated her as if she had. She added the solicitor's name beneath them. Then she closed the journal. She wrote to the firm herself that evening. A simple letter, politely worded, identifying herself as the Duchess of Ravenswood and inquiring, in the vaguest possible terms, the kind of terms that could mean anything, about the nature of the matter the firm was currently handling on behalf of the Duke. She did not expect a reply. Client confidentiality was absolute, and no reputable firm would disclose a client's business to a third party, even a third party who happened to be the client's wife. But she was not writing to receive information. She was writing to send it, to let them know, whoever they were, whatever they were doing, that there was someone at Ravenswood who was paying attention, that the Duchess was not, as perhaps they had been led to believe, irrelevant to this matter. She sealed the letter herself and gave it to a footman to post, not to Mr. Hobbs. She went down to dinner that evening and ate in the usual silence and watched Edmund read his correspondence at the other end of the table, and she thought about what Harwick had said. I believe he's known since then. What he's done with that knowledge, I can't tell you. He was 30 years old. He had inherited a title, an estate, a debt, and a crime all at once. He had grown up in this house, under a father who had been capable of engineering another family's destruction for the sake of a land parcel. He had discovered what his name meant, what his inheritance actually was, and had said nothing, done nothing visible. Continued as before, managing the estate, maintaining appearances, keeping Cecily in the master chamber and his wife at the far end of the table. Either he was a man who had looked at his father's crime and decided to protect it, or he was a man who had looked at it and not yet known how to begin undoing it. Both were possible. Both were consistent with everything she had observed. She needed one more thing. She needed to know whether Edmund was aware of the forged signature specifically, not just the payments, not just Arthur Ashford's existence, but the original crime itself, the contract, the stolen land. Because if he knew the full shape of it and had chosen silence, then they were opponents, and she would proceed accordingly. But if he knew only part of it, if his father had concealed the worst of it even from his own son, then there was another possibility, a more complicated one, the kind that required her to consider whether this man sitting at the far end of her dinner table, who had never once looked at her as if she were a person worth considering, might nonetheless be something other than her enemy. She was not ready to hope for that. Hope was expensive, and she had learned to spend it carefully. But she filed the possibility away. She was collecting possibilities the way she had collected everything else since arriving at Ravenswood, methodically, without attachment, keeping them until she knew what they were worth. 3 days later, something happened that she had not planned for. She was in the morning room after breakfast, a room she had begun to use because it had good light, and no one else seemed to want it, when Cecily walked in. Not the maid, not Mrs. Plum. Cecily herself, in a silk morning wrapper that cost more than Elizabeth's entire trousseau, moving through the room with the confidence of a woman who has never had reason to knock. She stopped when she saw Elizabeth. A brief hesitation, 1 second, no more, and then she continued to the window as if Elizabeth were a piece of furniture she had simply not noticed. Elizabeth put down her book. She did not stand. She looked at Cecily with the same steady, unhurried attention she had given to the ledgers, and she waited. Cecily looked out the window for a moment. Then she turned and looked at Elizabeth directly for the first time and smiled. It was a smile Elizabeth recognized. She had seen it on the faces of girls at school who had decided, for reasons entirely their own, that a particular person needed to be made to feel small. "You're very patient," Cecily said. "I'll give you that." "Thank you," Elizabeth said. "It won't change anything." Cecily tilted her head slightly. "You understand that. Whatever you're doing in that library, whatever your cousin said to you in the garden, it won't change anything. Edmund and I have an understanding that has nothing to do with you." Elizabeth looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up her book again. "I'm sure you believe that," she said pleasantly, and turned a page. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then she heard Cecily's slippers on the floor, moving away, and the door opening and closing. Elizabeth kept her eyes on her book and did not allow herself to feel anything until the footsteps had entirely faded. Then she let herself feel it, the small, cold satisfaction of having held absolutely still when everything in her had wanted to stand up. Cecily was frightened. Frightened women made mistakes. Elizabeth turned another page and waited to see what kind. The mistake came 11 days later, at a dinner for 16. On a Thursday evening in October when the first real cold had arrived, and the house smelled of wood smoke and candle wax, and the particular tension of a gathering that everyone present knows is not entirely what it appears to be. Elizabeth had spent those 11 days waiting. She was good at waiting. She had spent most of her adult life doing it, waiting for her father's moods to settle, waiting for circumstances to improve, waiting for someone to notice that she was in the room. She had learned, in all that waiting, to keep the surface still while everything underneath continued to move. It was the most useful thing her difficult life had taught her, and she was grateful for it in the way one is grateful for hard lessons, not warmly, but genuinely. She had also spent those 11 days watching Cecily. The morning room visit had changed something. Not in Elizabeth, she had been clear-eyed about Cecily from the first moment in the corridor, but in Cecily herself. She was moving differently now. Faster, with less of the easy confidence that had characterized her first weeks. She laughed too loudly at dinner and watched Elizabeth across the table with an attention she was not quite managing to disguise. She spoke to Edmund more often and more urgently in the corridors, in the low, insistent voice of a woman who is reminding a man of something he has not been attending to sufficiently. Edmund listened, said little. His face, as always, gave nothing away. Elizabeth watched all of it and said nothing and waited. The dinner guests arrived at 7. It was a local gathering, neighbors, a visiting baronet and his wife, 2 families from the adjoining county who had known the Ravenswood title for generations. The kind of dinner where everyone knew the furniture of everyone else's life, and any deviation from the expected arrangement would be noted, assessed, and discussed for weeks afterward. Elizabeth dressed carefully. Not her best, she had learned that her best tended to make people expect things she was not yet ready to deliver, but well. A deep blue-gray that her mother had always said suited her. Her mother's pearl earrings, which were small and very fine, and the only jewelry she owned that had not been sold. Her hair simply done, by her own hands, because she had never entirely trusted a stranger's hands near her head. She came downstairs at 10 minutes to 7 and stood in the entrance hall and received the guests alongside Edmund, which was her function as hostess, and which he could not, in front of 16 witnesses, deny her. He stood beside her with the correct expression and said the correct things and was, she noted, wearing his best coat. She wondered who he had dressed for. The guests filed in, the drawing room filled with conversation and candlelight. Elizabeth moved through it with the practiced ease of a woman who has been trained from childhood to be agreeable in rooms that do not particularly want her, and she listened more than she spoke, and she watched the door. Cecily entered at 7:15. She was not a guest. She had never been presented as a guest. The precise nature of her presence in the house was something the neighborhood understood in the particular way that neighborhoods understand things they are not supposed to discuss completely and in detail, and with considerable interest. She moved in the social spaces of Ravenswood the way water moves through a crack, not invited, not quite excluded, present by virtue of persistence and the absence of anyone willing to stop her. What she was wearing stopped the room. Not her gown, the gown was beautiful, deep rose silk, and entirely appropriate. It was what was in her hair. Pinned at her right temple, trailing over her bare shoulder, the ivory silk catching the candlelight with every movement she made. The veil, her mother's veil, the one with the hand-embroidered flowers, each one stitched by a woman who had believed her daughter deserved something beautiful. Worn as an accessory, as an ornament, pinned into an elaborate hairstyle with the careless ease of someone who has picked up a pretty thing because it was available and has given no further thought to what it might mean to anyone else. The room did not go silent, it was too well-bred for that, but Elizabeth felt the quality of the conversation change, the subtle shift of attention, eyes moving quickly and then away, performing the social calculation. Had everyone seen? Did everyone understand what they were seeing? What was the correct response? Someone laughed. A short, uncertain sound, the laugh of a person who has seen something and is not sure whether it is funny or not and has chosen funny as the safer option. 2 or 3 others followed. Not cruel laughter, not quite, but the laughter of people who have been given permission to find something amusing and have taken it. Edmund said nothing. He was standing 6 feet from Elizabeth. She felt rather than saw him, felt the particular stillness of a man who has just registered something and is deciding how to respond to it. But he did not speak. He looked at Cecily and then looked away, and his expression was the expression he applied to everything. Controlled, unreadable, committed to nothing. Elizabeth stood very still and felt the room the way you feel a current underwater, the direction of it, the force of it, the way it pulls. She looked at Cecily, who was smiling at something a guest had said, the veil trailing over her shoulder, entirely at ease. She looked at the guests, who were performing elaborate obliviousness. She looked at Edmund, who was looking at his brandy. Then she set down her glass. She crossed the room. Not quickly, there was no hurry, and hurry would have suggested something she did not want to suggest. She walked at the pace of a woman who knows exactly where she is going and sees no reason to rush, and the guests parted for her in the instinctive way of people who recognize, without being able to articulate why, that something significant is happening. She stopped in front of Cecily. Cecily looked at her. The smile remained, but it had changed, tightened at the edges, become something that required more effort than it was showing. Up close, Elizabeth could see the calculation in her eyes, the assessment. She had planned for several responses. She had not, Elizabeth thought, planned for this one. Elizabeth reached up with one hand and unpinned the veil from Cecily's hair. It took 3 pins, and she removed each one with the careful, unhurried attention of a woman who is in no danger of being rushed. Cecily stood perfectly still. What else could she do in a room full of witnesses? And said nothing. And the smile stayed on her face with the fixed quality of something that is being held there by considerable effort. The silk came free. Elizabeth folded it, once, twice, the way her mother had taught her to fold good fabric, with the embroidered side inward where it could not be damaged, and held it in both hands and turned back to the room. 16 people were not looking at her. They were performing, with varying degrees of skill, the act of looking at other things, the ceiling, their glasses, each other, while paying her the most complete attention she had received since arriving at Ravenswood. Elizabeth looked at them all very briefly, and then she addressed the table as if nothing in particular had occurred. "I believe dinner is ready," she said. "Shall we go in?" The dinner was the best she had hosted at Ravenswood, which was not a high bar, but she cleared it considerably. She was brilliant, not dazzlingly, not in a way that drew attention to itself, but with the steady, warm competence of a woman who is finally, for the first time in this house, operating on her own ground. She remembered names and connected them to the right details. She asked the right questions and listened to the answers and made each person at her end of the table feel, for the duration of the meal, that they were the most interesting person in the room. She was aware of Edmund throughout. He was at the far end, doing his own version of the same performance, the Duke's version, which was cooler and more authoritative and less interested in warmth. She was aware of him the way you are aware of a fire in a room, not looking at it directly, but never entirely forgetting it is there. He looked at her 7 times during the meal. She counted, because counting was something to do with the attention she could not afford to show. Cecily did not come to dinner. Elizabeth had not expected her to. The guests left at 11. Elizabeth stood at the door and said the correct things and watched the last carriage disappear down the drive, and then she turned back into the house and found that she was alone in the entrance hall. The servants had retreated. The candles in the side sconces were burning low. She still had the veil. She had carried it through the entire dinner, folded in her lap, and no one had mentioned it, and she had not mentioned it, and it had sat there between her hands like a small, quiet declaration. She was halfway up the stairs when she heard him behind her. "Elizabeth." It was the first time he had used her name. She had been at Ravenswood for 6 weeks, and it was the first time. She stopped on the stairs and turned and looked down at him, and he was standing at the bottom looking up, and his expression was different. Not warm, not apologetic, but different from everything she had seen from him before. The careful control was still there, but something beneath it had shifted, like a plate of ice that has moved without yet breaking. She waited. He looked at her for a moment, then he looked at the veil in her hands, then back at her face. "That was," he stopped, started again. "That was well done," he said. It came out with the particular difficulty of a man who is not accustomed to saying things he means. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had sat across from her for 6 weeks and spoken to her in corrections and silences, at the man who had let this happen and said nothing, at the man who might be her enemy or might be something else entirely, and whom she still could not read clearly enough to be certain. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. She turned and continued up the stairs. She did not look back. She went to her room and set the veil down on the writing table next to her journal and stood for a moment looking at both of them. Then she sat down, opened the journal, and beneath "I am here" and the solicitor's name, she wrote 4 more words. She closed it before she let herself think about what they meant. Tomorrow Edmund would come to her door. She did not know this with certainty, but she knew it the way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes by something in the air, a shift in pressure, the particular quality of the stillness just before. She was ready. He knocked at 10 in the morning. Not late at night, not at some fraught hour that would have made the conversation into something it was. 10 in the morning, when the house was moving and the light was clear and there was nothing dramatic about it except that it had never happened before. Elizabeth was at the writing table when she heard it, 3 knocks, firm and even, the knock of a man who has made a decision and intends to stand behind it. She closed her journal. "Come in." He entered and closed the door behind him, which was either courtesy or caution, and stood for a moment taking in the room the way he took in everything, efficiently, comprehensively, giving nothing away. His eyes moved over the writing table, the veil folded on its corner, the stack of books she had brought from the library. He did not sit. She did not offer. "Who is Harwick to you?" he said. It was not quite a question. Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "My cousin, I told you that. I mean beyond that." "Beyond that," she said. "He is someone who has known my family for 30 years and who thinks well of me, which is a shorter list than it ought to be and which I value accordingly." She paused. "Is that what you came to ask?" Something moved through his expression. Not quite anger, closer to the frustration of a man who has prepared for one conversation and found himself in a different one. "What are you planning?" he said. "Planning," Elizabeth repeated. She considered the word. "I have been in this house for 6 weeks. I have no authority over the menus, the accounts, the correspondence, or the arrangement of the furniture. I am addressed by the staff with the careful politeness one extends to a situation that has not yet been resolved. My predecessor's mistress wears my mother's veil to dinner." She looked at him. "What would you imagine I might be planning?" He was quiet for a moment. The light from the window was behind her, which she had not arranged deliberately, but which she noticed was making it difficult for him to read her face as easily as he usually did. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something, not afraid of it, but aware of it, measuring the distance. "I owe you an apology," he said. He said it the way someone says something they have rehearsed and then decided at the last moment to say differently. Plainly, without architecture. Elizabeth said nothing. She waited. "Several," he added, "the room, the veil, the general conduct of this household since your arrival." He stopped. His jaw tightened briefly as if the words were costing him something. "None of it was I did not," another stop. "It was wrong," he said finally. "Simply that, it was wrong." Elizabeth looked at him for a long time. At the man who had corrected her pronunciation and drunk his brandy in silence and let 16 guests watch his mistress wear her dead mother's needlework as a hair ornament. She looked at him and she thought, this could be true. It could also be strategy. A man who has discovered that his wife is less manageable than he assumed might find it useful to appear to have a conscience. She could not yet tell which this was. She was not sure he knew either. "Did you know," she said quietly, "what your father did to mine?" The silence that followed was the longest of the 6 weeks. Edmund stood very still, and Elizabeth watched his face with the same careful attention she had given the ledgers, and what she saw was not guilt and not surprise. It was something older and heavier than either, the expression of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has just been asked to set it down in front of someone else. "Yes," he said. One word. She had been prepared for denial, for deflection, for the elaborate performance of a man discovering something for the first time. She had not been prepared for one word, said with the particular exhaustion of someone who is done pretending. "How much?" she asked. "All of it." He moved to the window not to look out, she thought, but because he needed to move. "The contract, the signature, the land, Arthur Ashford." He said the name carefully as if it were something that needed to be handled. "I found my father's private correspondence 8 months ago when we were settling the estate, a locked box. The solicitor gave me the key." He paused. "I think my father intended me to find it. I think he wanted someone to know. At the end." "And the payments," Elizabeth said, "you stopped them." He turned to look at her. She watched him register that she knew, that she had found the ledgers, that she had seen the entries, that she had been paying a different kind of attention than he had assumed. She watched him recalibrate, and to his credit, he did it quickly and without protest. "I stopped them because Arthur Ashford is dead," he said. "He died in February in Calais. The solicitor wrote to inform me." He paused. "He had no family. He had been alone for 30 years. My father paid him to vanish, and he vanished so thoroughly that he disappeared from himself as well." His voice was even, but something beneath it was not. "I stopped the payments because there was no one left to pay, not because I intended to bury it." "And the London firm," Elizabeth said. This time the look he gave her was different, not recalibration, but something closer to relief, as if he had been waiting for her to get here, as if this was the question he had actually come to answer. "They are preparing a legal instrument," he said, "for the transfer of the northern parcels back to the Ashford family, with interest calculated from the date of the original transaction." He paused. It has taken longer than I would have liked. These things require the documentation has to be correct, or it will be challenged. I did not want to tell you until it was done. I did not want to make a promise I could not keep." Elizabeth sat with that for a moment. The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the garden, a bird was conducting a determined and repetitive argument with the morning. "Why," she said, "did you marry me?" He looked at her. "Your father approached my solicitor. He needed the debt settled. He stopped, considered. I thought a marriage to the Ashford family was the closest thing to restitution I could offer quickly, before the legal process was complete. I thought," he stopped again, and this time the stop was longer, and when he continued his voice was quieter. "I thought it was the right thing to do. I handled it badly. I handled everything about it badly." "Yes," Elizabeth said, "you did." He accepted that without flinching. She gave him credit for it. "I want Cecily gone," Elizabeth said. She said it without anger, without drama, in the tone of someone stating a condition that is not subject to negotiation. "Not because of the veil, not because of last night, because I cannot build anything in this house while she is in it, and I intend to build something." She paused. "I also want the household accounts, full access, full authority, and I want my name on the correspondence." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze and did not fill the silence with anything, because she had learned in 6 weeks that silence was a pressure that worked in her favor if she could stand it. "Cecily will be gone by the end of the week," he said. "The accounts and the correspondence, yes, all of it." He paused. "Is there anything else?" "Not today," she said. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile, not quite, but it was the closest thing to one she had ever seen from him, and it was gone almost before she was certain it had been there at all. He moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back, and looked at her across the room with the expression of a man assembling something difficult into words. "The ledgers," he said, "my mother's library, she left them there deliberately. She knew, I think, about the payments, if not all of it. She wanted someone to find them." He paused. "I think she would have liked you." Elizabeth looked at him. At this man she had married in the mathematics of desperation, who had corrected her and ignored her and failed her in every ordinary way, and who had also, quietly and imperfectly and without telling her, been trying to undo 30 years of his father's crime. She did not forgive him. Forgiveness was a different thing, a larger thing, and it would take time she was not yet ready to count. But she felt something shift, not toward him exactly, but in the direction of the possibility of toward. A door not yet open but no longer locked. "Tell me about her," Elizabeth said. "Your mother." He blinked. It was the first unguarded thing she had ever seen him do. "Now," he said. "If you have time," she said. "Sit down, Edmund." It was the first time she had used his name. She watched him register it, the small, involuntary stillness of a man who has just heard something he was not expecting and does not know yet what to do with it. He sat down. And for the first time since Elizabeth Ashford had arrived at Ravenswood Manor, the two people who lived in it talked to each other. Not about the estate, not about arrangements, not in corrections and silences. Simply talked, haltingly at first, with the particular awkwardness of strangers who have been pretending not to be strangers for too long, about a woman who had locked a room and kept a key, and trusted that the right person would eventually come looking. Outside, the October light moved across the floor between them. The bird in the garden gave up its argument and went quiet. The house, for the first time, felt like something other than a place Elizabeth was enduring. It felt, tentatively and without any guarantees, like somewhere she might eventually be able to stay. She did not tell him about the letter she had sent to the London firm. She was not ready to. Trust was not a door you walked through all at once. It was a corridor, and you moved through it carefully, checking the floor as you went. But that evening at dinner, he sat at the correct end of the table. Not at the far end, not at the distance that had been their arrangement for 6 weeks. He moved his place without comment and without explanation, and the footman adjusted without blinking, and Edmund poured her wine himself and asked, with the careful effort of a man learning a new language, what she had been reading. Elizabeth looked at him across a distance that was suddenly, remarkably, small enough to speak across without raising her voice. "History," she said. "Mostly. Useful subject," he said. "I find it so," she agreed. It was not much. It was not nearly enough. But it was a beginning, and Elizabeth Ashford had learned in a harder school than most that beginnings were not nothing. Beginnings were, in fact, everything if you were careful enough and patient enough and brave enough to let them be. She was all three. She had been all along. She just hadn't had anywhere to put it yet. Cecily left on a Wednesday. Quietly, without spectacle, with 2 trunks and a maid and a carriage that Edmund arranged, and Elizabeth did not ask about. Elizabeth was in the library when it happened, and she stayed there deliberately, because she had no interest in watching and no need to. The departure itself was sufficient. She did not require the sight of it. What she did not anticipate was what Cecily took with her. She discovered it 3 days later when she went to the library and found the lowest shelf disturbed. The unread volumes replaced at slightly wrong angles. The green ledgers, all 6 of them, gone. Elizabeth stood in front of the empty shelf for a long moment. Then she sat down at the desk, folded her hands, and thought very carefully about what this meant and what it did not mean and what, given the current state of everything, she was going to do about it. She was still thinking when Mrs. Plum appeared in the doorway, not knocking, which told Elizabeth it was urgent, with an expression that was trying very hard to be composed and not entirely succeeding. "There is a message, Your Grace," she said, "from Miss Vane." The message was brief. Cecily had the ledgers. She intended to bring them to Lord Ashworth, the most prominent member of the county magistracy, a man who had known Edmund's father and who had, Elizabeth happened to know, considerable reasons of his own to find the Ravenswood family inconvenient. She would present them as evidence of financial misconduct on the part of the current Duke. The payments to Arthur Ashford, stripped of context, stripped of the crime that had necessitated them, read very simply as 3 decades of unexplained expenditure from the estate accounts. Enough to raise questions, enough to damage. She was not asking for money. She was not in the message asking for anything. It was not a negotiation. It was a statement, a door swinging open on a drop. Elizabeth read it twice. Then she went to find Edmund. He was in the study. He read the message once, set it on the desk, and was quiet for long enough that Elizabeth counted 12 seconds. "The legal transfer," she said. "Where does it stand?" "Complete," he said. "As of last week. The instrument is signed and lodged. The Ashford land is formally transferred." He paused. "But the ledgers are without context. They look like concealment," she said. "I know. If Ashworth sees them before we can explain, he will see what Cecily wants him to see," Elizabeth said. "Yes." Edmund stood up, moved to the window. He had the look of a man running calculations that were not adding up the way he needed them to, and Elizabeth recognized it because she had worn that look herself, privately, more times than she could count in the past weeks. "I'll go to Ashworth directly," he said. "Get ahead of it. Explain the context before she—" "No," Elizabeth said. He turned, looked at her. "If you go to him now, you look like a man managing a story," she said. "You look like someone who knew there was a problem and is trying to contain it. That is not the position we want to be in." She paused. "Let her go to him. Let her present the ledgers, and then we present everything else." "Everything else," he repeated. "Harwick has the original contract, the forged signature, the solicitor's letter." She met his eyes. "The full story makes the ledgers comprehensible. The payments were not concealment, they were your father managing a witness to his own crime. And you, when you discovered it, acted to correct it. The land transfer is already lodged. That is not the action of a man covering something up." She paused. "That is the action of a man with a conscience." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. Something was moving through his expression that she could not entirely name. It was too layered, too complicated. But at the bottom of it, she thought, was something that looked very much like the specific relief of a man who has been carrying something alone and has just been told he no longer has to. "You planned for this," he said. "It was not quite an accusation. It was closer to wonder." "I planned for several things," Elizabeth said. "This was one of them." What she had not planned for was how quickly it would move, or how publicly. Cecily went to Ashworth on a Friday. By Saturday morning, the news had moved through the county in the way that damaging news always moves, faster than light, in all directions at once, gathering weight as it went. By Saturday afternoon, Edmund had received 3 letters and 2 visits from men who were variously concerned, curious, or quietly pleased, depending on their history with the Ravenswood name. The formal gathering was Ashworth's idea. He was a procedural man, a man who believed that things ought to be done correctly, and doing this correctly meant, in his view, that all parties should be present. He sent the invitation on Saturday evening. Sunday afternoon, the assembled families of the county, 20, perhaps 25, the kind of gathering that was not quite a trial but was not quite not one either. Elizabeth dressed with particular care. Not armor, she had decided against armor, against anything that looked like she was preparing for a battle, because battles were for people who were not certain of winning. She wore the blue-gray again, her mother's pearls, her hair simply done. Edmund came to her door at noon. He was already dressed, and he looked at her for a moment in the way he had begun to look at her, with the careful, slightly wondering attention of a man who keeps being surprised by what he sees and has not yet decided what to do about that. "Are you ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" The corner of his mouth moved. "I find I am," he said, surprisingly. Ashworth's drawing room was full when they arrived. Elizabeth walked in on Edmund's arm. She had not done this before. They had not done this, and she felt the room register it immediately, the small shift of attention that meant something was different from what had been expected. And she kept her chin level and her expression pleasant, and looked at no one in particular and everyone at once. Cecily was there, standing near the window with the ledgers on the table beside her, and the expression of a woman who has been certain of something for long enough that she has stopped being able to imagine being wrong. She looked at Elizabeth, and then at Edmund, and then back at Elizabeth, and for just a moment something flickered in her eyes, not doubt, not yet, but the shadow of it. Ashworth opened the proceedings with the careful gravity of a man who takes his own importance seriously and has never had reason to revise that assessment. He presented the ledgers. He described what Miss Vane had brought to his attention. He spoke of the unexplained payments, the decades of undisclosed expenditure, the questions this raised about the management of a ducal estate. He spoke for 9 minutes. Elizabeth counted. Then Edmund spoke. Clearly, without notes, with the particular authority of a man who is saying the truth and knows it and does not need to dress it up. He told them about his father's letter, about the forged contract, about Arthur Ashford, about the London firm and the legal transfer already lodged, already complete. He told them, without drama and without apology, the full shape of what his father had done and what he had done about it. The room was completely still by the time he finished. Then Harwick stood up. He had arrived that morning. Elizabeth had written to him 4 days ago because she had been planning for several things, and this was one of them. And he placed the original contract on Ashworth's table and the solicitor's letter beside it, and he said, in the pleasant and unhurried voice of a man with nothing to hide, that he believed this settled the matter. Ashworth looked at the documents for a long time. Then he looked at Cecily. Then he looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth met his gaze and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The room had already decided. She could feel it, the shifting of weight, the recalibration, the particular sound of 20 people quietly revising what they thought they knew. Cecily left before the tea was served. She did not say goodbye. The ledgers remained on Ashworth's table. On the drive home, Edmund was quiet for a long time. The afternoon light was doing the amber thing again, the thing it had done on the day Elizabeth arrived, and she looked at the same countryside through the carriage window and thought about how different it looked when you were not afraid of it. "The letter you sent to the London firm," Edmund said. "When they wrote back to tell me I was—" He stopped. I wasn't angry. I want you to know that. I was another stop. He appeared to be having some difficulty with the vocabulary. I was glad, he said finally, that you were paying attention, that someone was. Elizabeth looked at him, at this man, at all of it. You could have told me, she said, any of it from the beginning. Yes, he said, I know that now. He paused. I didn't know how. I didn't know. He turned to look at her, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, stripped of all the management and the control and the careful distance. I didn't know who you were, he said. I did not take the time to find out, and that was, he stopped. That was the worst of it, worse than any of the rest. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. The carriage moved through the amber light. Ravenswood appeared through the window, stone and glass, and she looked at it, and it looked, for the first time, like somewhere she had chosen rather than somewhere she had been sent. You know now, she said. He held her gaze. I'm beginning to, he said. I'd like to continue. Elizabeth looked back at the house coming toward them through the light, and she allowed herself, carefully, without hurry, the way she did everything, to feel the full weight of that. What it meant. What it might become. The length and the difficulty and the occasional grace of building something real with an imperfect person in an imperfect world. She had wanted, once, to leave this house. She had stood in the east wing with a candle and written 3 words in a journal and meant them as a reminder that she existed. She existed. She had always existed. She had simply needed somewhere worthy of it. So would I, she said. The carriage turned through the gate. The door of Ravenswood Manor opened before they reached it, Mrs. Plum, on the steps, with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has just seen it arrive. Elizabeth stepped down first, looked up at the house. Then she walked up the steps and through her own front door, and this time no one made her use a different entrance. Spring came late to Ravenswood that year, but when it came completely, all at once, the way things do when they have been held back long enough. The gardens, which had been brown and closed when Elizabeth arrived, opened into something she had not expected, ordered and beautiful and very clearly the work of a woman who had cared about them deeply and had passed that care into the soil itself. She spent a great deal of time in them now. The household had changed in the way that households change when someone begins to actually run them, not dramatically, not with upheaval, but in the accumulation of small corrections that add up, over months, to something entirely different. The menus reflected what the house actually needed. The correspondence went out under Elizabeth's hand as often as Edmund's. The staff moved with the ease of people who know where they stand and are not afraid of it. Mrs. Plum had stopped watching Elizabeth for signs of what she was going to do and had begun simply working alongside her, which was, Elizabeth thought, the best possible version of that relationship. Edmund's younger sister came to stay in April. She was 19, bright, with the kind of humor that had clearly been kept quiet for years and was now discovering what happened when it was. She and Elizabeth liked each other immediately, in the uncomplicated way of women who recognize in each other a particular quality. The quality of having been underestimated for long enough to find it funny rather than merely painful. Her debut was planned for the following season, under the Ravenswood name, with Elizabeth managing the arrangements. It would be a good debut. Elizabeth intended it to be excellent. Harwick came in May, as he had promised. He stayed 4 days and was as charming as ever and treated Edmund with the careful, slightly testing courtesy of a man who has not yet entirely decided what he thinks, but is willing to be persuaded. Edmund, for his part, was courteous and direct, and did not try to be charming, which Elizabeth had come to recognize as his version of sincerity. By the 3rd day, they were talking about horses with the comfortable ease of men who have found common ground and are relieved by it. On his last evening, Harwick found Elizabeth in the garden and stood beside her for a moment looking at the rose beds and said, without preamble, "He loves you, you know." Elizabeth considered this. "He is learning too," she said. "So am I. We are doing it at approximately the same pace, which seems fair." Harwick smiled. "Your mother would have liked this," he said, All of it. She would have been insufferably pleased with you." Elizabeth looked at the roses for a moment. "I know," she said. "I think about that." She thought about it often, not with grief anymore, or not only with grief, but with something warmer underneath it. The particular comfort of knowing that you have become, eventually, the person someone believed you could be. The veil hung in Elizabeth's sitting room. Not on the wall, she had not wanted to make a monument of it, but in a frame on the writing table, where the light caught the embroidery in the mornings. The ivory silk had been cleaned and pressed and restored by hands Elizabeth had arranged and paid for herself, and the tiny roses her mother had stitched looked exactly as they had looked when they were new, patient, and precise, and made with the kind of love that does not require acknowledgement to be real. Edmund had found the frame. He had said nothing about it, simply placed it on her table one morning and left. She had said nothing about it either. Some things did not require words, and they were both learning, slowly and imperfectly, to tell the difference between the silences that were distance and the silences that were something else entirely. She was at the writing table one morning in late May when he came in, not knocking, the way he had learned she preferred, and set a cup of tea beside the frame and stood for a moment looking at the veil through the glass. "My mother embroidered," he said. "Did I tell you that?" "No," Elizabeth said. "She was very good at it." He looked at the roses. She would have recognized the work. She would have known what it was the first time she saw it. He paused. "I think that's why she left you the key. I think she knew somehow that whoever came next would be someone who understood what careful hands mean, what it costs to make something beautiful for someone else." Elizabeth looked at the frame, at the roses her mother had made, at 6 years of winter mornings and failing light and fingers that hurt and never stopped. "Yes," she said quietly, "I think you're right." Edmund sat down across from her, in the chair he had taken that October morning, the first time he came to her room, the first time anything between them had been honest, and picked up the book she had left open on the table and looked at the page. "History again," he said. "Always," she said. He settled into the chair with the ease of a man who has found a room he did not know he needed, and Elizabeth picked up her tea, and the morning light moved across the writing table between them, and the roses in the frame caught it and held it, the way beautiful things do, briefly, warmly, without making any promises about tomorrow. It was enough. It was, Elizabeth thought, more than enough. It was, in fact, exactly what careful hands, and enough time and one very good key, had been building toward all along. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed one of our stories, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join as a member or send a super thanks or super chat. Your support helps us continue creating more stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories.